For more on this, we've reached Daniel Levy. He's a former Israeli peace negotiator and president of the U.S. Middle East Project, a not-for-profit policy institute, and he joins us this morning from London. Mr. Levy, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Pleasure to be with you, Marianne, despite the circumstances.
Absolutely. And let's just talk about what we're hearing so far, that Israel has essentially agreed to a plan that would see a 6-week ceasefire in exchange for hostages. And the U.S. says the ball is now in Hamas's court. So what do you make of where things stand right now?
Well, these negotiations have, of course, been ongoing with the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, the U.S. dealing back-to-back with the Israeli side and the Hamas side. I think the details really matter. So when the U.S. says Israel has more or less agreed to the framework, we're going to have to drill down on that. I fear that what we're looking at is a blame game, because there's two ways of interpreting what's happening right now, Marianne. The hopeful way of interpreting it is that we are edging closer, and therefore there is a maneuver going on by each side trying to increase the pressure on the other, not wanting to be blamed. The other is that the terms of this arrangement are still not close enough. The fundamental gap is an Israeli position which says 6-week pause followed by, and here it's important to pay attention to the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet, because they are saying they are fully unequivocally committed to continuing the war after the 40-day pause, and that they will move on Rafah, where 1.5 million Palestinians have been kettled, having been sent from one place to another, told that's a safe zone. It became anything but. So that's the Israeli position, more war. The Hamas position is, unless there are guarantees that this is going to be the on-ramp to a permanent ceasefire, then there will not be a deal. Now, is there going to be an attempt to fudge that, to try and thicken the layers where it becomes more and more implausible, even if it desires to do so, for Israel to continue with this level of operation and destruction? Or is that just going to be a fundamental break? Even if we overcome that question, there's the details of who will be released from the hostages. This is the only way the hostages will get out in real numbers. What kinds of humanitarian assistance, how quantities will Israel allow in, given the horrendous conditions for the Palestinian civilian population? Will Palestinians be able to move back to the north? Where will Israel position itself militarily during this pause? Which Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, numbers, type of prisoners will be released? That's an awful lot to still get closure on, Marianne.
A lot of questions there. Also, let's talk about Hamas, because you're saying this could be pointing fingers at this point. Hamas says a deal could be reached very soon if Israel agrees to a military withdrawal from Gaza and more aid. So just talking more about where you've been taking us so far, how realistic is that?
You know what I think is the key to understanding this, Marianne? I think the details, if we are not going to get a deal, then of course each side is going to point to the other in terms of why it didn't happen. And we have to remember here that you also have a sovereign state that's an occupying power that has responsibilities on the Israeli side, of course. Hamas, I think the investigations will be clear, violated international law in the nature of the action it undertook on October 7th. Israel, since October 7th, indiscriminately targeting civilians, now in violation of the provisional measures called for by the International Court of Justice in a case of the plausible committing of genocide, has also been in violation of law, international law, every day since. So if we step back, I think the real question is, will there be leverage in order to get this to end? I think Hamas will accept a ceasefire and a release of those hostages under the right conditions. Will Israel accept a ceasefire and the conditions where they can bring the hostages back? And the determining point might be, because things are quite stalemated on the battlefield, you don't have other levers, the determining point might be whether the Biden administration in the US wants to play the blame game, wants to look as if it cares by doing airdrops which are woefully insufficient, or actually wants to bring this to an end, because the Biden administration has the leverage, on the Israeli government, if it stops providing the arms especially, to get terms out of Israel which could be acceptable more broadly and could end this. Thus far, that has not been the position of the Biden administration. And that is really the dynamic we're in here more than anything else.
And you're speaking to us, of course, as a former negotiator. We are looking at a timeline. The clock is ticking. Both parties want an agreement before Ramadan. That's a week from now. So speaking more as with your experience as a former negotiator, what is the most important thing that needs to get done in order for this deal to be done?
It really depends whether there can be a compelling enough case made that despite the commitment and intentions of Israel to continue the war, that there is a strong reason to believe from the Palestinian Hamas side that the war could end. And then it's a question of pushing through on the final details. However, Ramadan beginning, the holy month beginning, is not a magic date. And if more is not done to change that equation, and especially because there is a debate inside Israel, not over whether they should do the mission or not in general, but there is a debate over whether to prioritize the hostages and whether this narrative of total victory, which is totally unrealistic, is something they should still pursue. There is some exhaustion in the military side. Is Israel going to go with the Netanyahu permanent war vision, or are they going to be reined back in? And the more they are allowed to act with impunity and to believe they have a permanent war option, the more likely they are going to prefer the blame game to the getting this done. And that's why, one of the reasons why you have the families of the hostages marching on Jerusalem, howling to their government, prioritize our hostages, because that is something that Netanyahu has conspicuously not done, which isn't to say there are not things Hamas have to undertake. But I do think that Hamas have set out a position which, we have to be honest, is not unreasonable, which is to have a ceasefire. I'm not saying October 7th was reasonable, but the negotiating position today is not unreasonable.
Let's talk about just looking forward. Talk of this two-state solution very much revived in the past few months. This is an idea that didn't work before. We don't know what this means looking forward. Why is this something Western nations are still coming back to if there aren't new ideas brought to the table? Where does that leave this conflict?
I think you put your finger on it, Marianne. I see very little value or seriousness or intellectual honesty, let alone political honesty, in the return to talk of a two-state outcome when they are not suggesting to do anything different to what was done in the past. This collapsed in significant measure because Israel could do everything to undermine a two-state outcome with no costs or consequences. And therefore, the Israeli public, who were told, listen, whatever you think of the Palestinians, human, subhuman, and this was the language being used, we can't get away with it. We're going to have to give them their state. And then Israel saw that it could build more settlements. It could entrench occupation. It could displace Palestinians. It could put in place a system which the blue chip human rights organizations in the world, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and 25 states at the International Court of Justice has said is a system of apartheid. And the likes of Canada, the US, Western Europe would all sit around and say, we will not hold you to account. Maybe occasionally we'll use some rhetoric to say, really, finger wag, you shouldn't do this. But everything else went on as usual. And in this asymmetrical type of conflict, in this balance of power, if the party that is permanently in occupation and denying Palestinian rights is not held to account and feels it can get away with it, then unfortunately, and this is what we've experienced, unfortunately, the politics gets more and more extreme until you have the likes of latter-era Netanyahu and these guys, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, who don't flinch at the accusation of apartheid. They wear it as a badge of pride. You have them in government. So unless Palestinians can choose a leadership that really represents them, unless the monopoly of the US is changed, and unless Israel is held to account for preventing Palestinian rights, I don't think the newfound talk of peace and two states is any more serious than the failures of the last decades.
Daniel Levy, I want to thank you so much for your time, your insights, your opinions this morning. Daniel Levy is a former Israeli peace negotiator.